So let's talk about this ecosystem conversation. Let's kind of get into this. Say, you know, what is this ecosystem we keep on talking about, and what are we referring to? This is actually when I first got into this space, I didn't understand what the word ecosystem meant. Actually, it was a bit of a confusing word. And if you, unfortunately, in this market, and we're in developing market, you have a lot of what's referred to as donor rhetoric. These are donors. These are people who are not from here, and they're donating money and getting influence on behalf of that money. And so this is the US government, every single bilateral institution, multilateral institutions, World Bank, EU, right? These institutions here. And so they end up driving this rhetoric about what ecosystem means. And unfortunately, when they speak in a very vague, difficult to follow conversation. There are 4 people that are part of this ecosystem. You're in one of them. You're in a university. This is the first building block of the ecosystem, right? What's another building block of the ecosystem? There's only 4. Universities. Somebody say money. Thank you. The government. And who else? The 4th player. Huh? No, investors is money. It's the 4th person, is the corporates, so the companies. The companies that are being generated. Now, a lot of literature will have you think that there are 20 other actors in this space. They're not there. If you were to look at any ecosystem globally, whether it's Silicon Valley, Los Angeles, Boston, Toronto, Tel Aviv, Tokyo, Dubai, Tallinn, Estonia. Any ecosystem, the government is heavily involved, to the tune of 30 to 40% of most revenue of most companies. Apple, it's 30 to 40% of its revenue from the US government. Microsoft, same. HP, the same. Google, same. Facebook, same. Government is the demand person in the ecosystem. And without a demand profile, without a demand from the government, it's very difficult to get this early stage ecosystem started. So you want to see a PPDA window just for early stage, separate from big business, construction, mining, whatever, all that corporate stuff, right? Coca-Colas and all that stuff, right? You want to segregate and separate those things. So ecosystem, quite specifically, the demand side of it comes from the government. It starts there. Wonderful. I was at the Ministry of Finance 15th National Competitiveness Forum last week, where they're talking about how to get from $40 billion in revenue, which is how much you make as a country, it's your GDP, to 500. Go 10x. How do you go 10x in 10 years? Extremely difficult. So how do you get to that point? Early stage is a huge part of that conversation. They launched and communicated to us a wonderful program they did under Kira Motors, right? The buses, these electronic buses. They've got a fantastic factory out in Jinja. If you went to this factory, it looks like I'm in China or United States. It's amazing. Done a really good job there. But how do you propagate that to the rest of the country, right? It's actually quite a difficult thing. So when we think about the ecosystem, that's what we're referring to. If we talk about it in the context of the demand profile and the ecosystem, money, capital is the most important piece of this too. So you have the government and then you have the capital. Without the capital provision out there to go ahead and provide the ecosystem with the support it needs to get going, meaning you up front have this wonderful idea and you need $10,000, $20,000, $50,000, and you need to move on a project. Who does that? VC does that, right? We do that. But you don't just do it for anybody, you only do it to the best ideas and the people who are most capable. And there's characteristics of what those people look like. I'm not talking physically, but from a profile perspective. And those are the people that we end up investing in. But when you think about it from a capital perspective, in the United States alone, 43% of the S&P of our stock exchange is VC backed. It started at VC. It started with an idea. If you look at it from a market cap perspective, over half of our market cap, VC. Market cap meaning the value of those assets, right? And when you think about it in terms of employees, VC backs over a third of all employment in the country. So VC is a significant part of the economy, and this part of that ecosystem we're referring to. Next slide. Just contextually, when you think about VC, you have many stages. This is contextually what's happening in the ecosystem, everything from seed, angel, pre-series, series A, B, C, D, and beyond. These are different levels of capital that you allocate to early stage ideas. And one of the reasons, unfortunately, in markets like Africa, which you see this, what you see is about 85–90% of the VC, venture capital money, entering the African market, which is about only 2% of the global market. It sits at around $4.5 billion in the entire continent of all 55 countries. Vast majority of that comes from the United States. Why? Because we have long-term capital wealth accumulation, right? So we can spend $1 million and it doesn't really hit our checkbook, right? It doesn't like bother us. Whereas if you spend $1 million here out of your pocket, it's like a big thing, right? It's a big thing. But we have to get to that point where we're saving up our capital, and you save up your capital through things like, and you won't like this, NSSF. I know it's a very political football, but it's the most important form of long-term capital savings in the market. It's the largest piece, $13 trillion shillings, right? This is very significant. Pensions, right? Long-term savings is where this opportunity comes from. So it's important to understand that for you as what I'm hoping to see, what I think I see as budding technologists in this market. So that's what I think I see when I look out. Next slide. So again, when we think about this context of ecosystem, what are we talking about? We as a company define it into 4 primary categories, right? We talk about it in the context of ecosystem, talk about it in the context of origination, the context of capital, which is money, what we deal with, and finally in the context of the firm. And each have their own definitions, and those definitions are the definitions we are quite frankly trying to lobby for to make sure that the Ugandan government doesn't misdefine this stuff, because it's very easy to do. And if you look at the current policies getting started for the Startup Act, which is happening right now, if you're not aware, the Ugandan government is, through a few ministries, trying to actually work out what it means to be a startup. So here's what the SME and also the corporate policy defines. If you are of a certain number of employees, if you are of a certain size in revenue, meaning turnover, annual turnover, or if you are of a certain age. Right? Now, the problem with that, I'm going to give you an example, and this I just want to throw this out here for contextual purposes. Does everyone know Twitter? You remember, X, formerly Twitter, right? Largest social media platform, right? When Elon bought Twitter, how old was Twitter? It was 10 years old. It had been on the market for 10 years when Elon bought it a couple years ago. It made $4 billion in revenue every year, $4 billion US dollars. That's approximately 10 GDP points of Uganda. Significant. How many employees did Twitter have at that time? Thousands of employees, thousands, more than this entire building. They were still considered a startup. Why? Why? They didn't break even. They were still young in the context of media in their industry. They were only 10 years old. Media has been around for thousands of years. When you compare 10 to 1,000, arguably you could say that that's pretty young, right? So it's not, what number is it? It's very difficult. And whether or not that product market fit actually went in there is another way. So we really have to rethink and redefine what we're talking about when we're talking about ecosystem and early stage. The last thing I want to mention here as we close up, and then I want to open up for questions, is one of the things that we were hired to do, we did some work for the bilateral. So bilateral institutions are governments who are doing work in your country. The Dutch, the Danish, the Germans, the French, the Brits, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Americans, the Canadians, yeah? There's a group called the Private Sector Working Group. I sit on that group, and I represent the early stage private sector, and we did research for that group. It also included the multilaterals, the EU, World Bank, the UN, those are multilateral institutions. And they're all asking the same question. What is it that what are we spending our money on? How much money are we spending and what are we spending our money on? So in Uganda alone, those institutions generate about 10% of your GDP. It's about $4 billion US. And they allocate 80% of that to SME programming. And 80% of that money is in the context of training. I just want to ask you a very simple question. Is it possible to train somebody and create a job? Is it? Is it possible to train somebody and create a job? And this is what that $4 billion is trying to ask, and unfortunately has failed miserably for a number of years. There's not a single job that's been created from that training. And so the question is how or what are you going to be allocating that $4 billion to? And our interest is to say, well, why wouldn't you put it into early stage? Right? So that's kind of the conversation that's happening. When we end up doing that research for them, we ended up mapping it in the context of ecosystem. If you were to take all the ecosystems that are super successful, Silicon Valley, Tel Aviv, Los Angeles, Boston, what are the main characteristics that you see in each of those ecosystems? What's the number one characteristic that you think you probably see in that ecosystem? You ever heard of Stanford, MIT, Tel Aviv University? These are the foremost universities and probably the best universities in their class when it comes to education. It's extremely expensive to get in, very difficult, very competitive, but they're also producing the most startups and the most companies. It's educational institutions. So if there's not that convergence of talent out there, the ecosystem doesn't exist. And that's one of the 10 components that we ended up identifying here. So every startup has a basic structure. You have a business guy and you got a tech guy, right? I mean, for the most part. You got a guy who knows how to market, a guy who knows the technology. And 100% of the 150, either the technology guy screwed over the business guy or the business guy screwed over the tech guy. Not 90%, 100 in this market. You can't have an ecosystem that doesn't have neutrality as a fundamental premise, meaning when I speak and I tell you, hey, I'm doing this thing, I'm doing a venture studio here in Kamocha. Am I worried about you copying my venture studio? Not really. But if you talk to the startups, they're worried about saying that because they're worried that somebody's going to copy their idea. And it's because of this reason. So there is something about neutrality that's super important. Obviously, you need to have convergence in terms of infrastructure, transport. You need to have airports, roads, train, rivers, right? There's no inbound geographically space where you don't have water associated with a good ecosystem. It doesn't exist. Just think about that. Long-term capital, high quality of life, I said. You obviously have to have some kind of existing industry. When you think about Silicon Valley and when it started, the #1 industry in Silicon Valley at the time, it was a big orchard, right? It was oranges, apricots, I think. Orchard, just trees, fruit trees. The first people that were in there was the United States military, the Navy, NASA, the space program, and then the Air Force. And so you had this military who was training all these electrical engineers who could figure out how to work with electronics. And that's how Silicon Valley gets started, right? Through that industry. So you want to think about that from that perspective in terms of ecosystem, and we're contextualizing this. As a company that's working in this space, I want to leave you with this message when it comes to ecosystem. There is an opportunity here in Uganda to do something really unique and really special, but you do need certain people to sort of be a part of that. And so one of the things that, and the reason why I'm involved in education is because I think it does start at the university level. And so how do we get a challenge? How do we get a demo day? How do we get a business competition going right here in Isbat or right here in Cavendish? So with money behind it, right? That's kind of the idea that I'm after, to sort of generate and start ideas to start flowing. So once you get those ideas to start flowing, you start seeing some real successes, and there have been a few on the market, right? We have a few unicorns, but we also have a lot of folks who have exited the market, meaning they started a firm, raised capital, got bought out. Right? This is the pathway for this market. So I want to leave you with that. I'd love to see and think about that. I don't know if ISBOT has a student body, or I don't know what you call it. A student guild. I would encourage whoever's the head of the student guild to go ahead and talk to some of the people on the market and see how you could get them on board. You know one right here in front of you. Get them on board to go ahead and see how you can end up starting a business plan competition, a demo day, something that actually brings ideas together, pitches them, starts to evolve that conversation with real money behind it, real backers behind it, and doing that kind of thing. So I'm going to leave you with that. I appreciate you guys listening to me.